Hello, hello, hello.
Hello. Hello, all you gals and girls out there in Radioland.
In my day.
In my day, we didn't have podcasts. We only had broadcasting. And in broadcasting, it's when you went on the air. The air back in those days is when particles would float in, literally, the air, which would carry sound waves from one device to the other. And in my day, nobody said literally as much as they do nowadays. There was no ringy-dingies after saying literally. And now, time for the Carnival Personnel Sideshow with Joe and Jacques. Take it away, boys.
Thank you, old Groucho. Welcome to Carnival Personnel's Sideshow. I'm Jacques.
And I'm Joe.
And Jerry Lewis is dead.
Yeah, I'm Joe. And Jerry Lewis is still dead.
Yes. I've come to bury Caesar.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's hard to again, we've lost like 3 comedic talents this week that we talked about a little bit on Carnival Personnel on the Sunday night broadcast.
Monday,
thank you. But Jerry Lewis, I want to say unarguably like the king of comedy. I mean, and I'm not quoting the movie, title from the 80s, but truly, this is a guy who died at 91, started acting on stage at the Catskills with his parents in a family act at age 5. So wow. 91 minus 5, like that's a shitload of years. Seriously, 8 decades. And again, he was one generation behind the Bob Hopes and the Bing Crosbys and all that stuff. But you're talking, he was in the public eye on a major national, international level ever since 1945.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, full disclosure, I wasn't a big Jerry Lewis fan growing up. Not that I didn't like Jerry Lewis. I was just sort of indifferent to Jerry Lewis. Like, I just wasn't roped in by the magic of Jerry Lewis. I think maybe he was a little too old school for me at the time growing up. Of course, he begat many other comedians who eventually begat Jim Carrey, who I thought was great.
Right.
But Jim Carrey was sort of like the 90s version of Jerry Lewis. But yeah, Jerry Lewis started it all. He kickstarted that sort of goofy, off-the-wall, I'm turning my brain off because Jerry's going to do all the thinking for me.
Right.
Comedy.
And Jerry himself was a comedy historian. Like, he truly studied what is funny and why. It's great. We'll get into it, but it's like one of the old jokes is like, why does the French like Jerry Lewis so much? And it's like, when he dies and gets to heaven, if God is French, there's going to be the fanfare, the red carpet, the trumpets, the big parade, the whole celebration. And if God isn't French, God's going to come down off the throne and say, why do the French like you so much? But he was a true, pioneer in filmmaking. He was a true pioneer in so many aspects of comedy. But again, one of the reasons being a comedy geek that I am, this is somebody who started on the stage, was a nightclub comedian, turned radio personality, turned TV personality, turned movie star, had hit records, like actually could sing. Everybody from that era were amazing dancers, could play several instruments, couldn't just get by with just singing, just dancing, just acting. They could do everything.
Triple or even a quadruple threat to make it.
And it's one of those things where, there's so many great documentaries with every huge comedian in the past 60 years all lining up to say what they like best about Jerry. So I'm a little older than Joe, but my introduction to Jerry truly was back then in like the 70s. It was always the telethons were huge. I mean, it was always Labor Day weekend. I was telling Joe, and he was just kind of shaking his head in disbelief, how that was a huge thing for me and our old next door neighbor, my buddy Mike growing up. We would, as kids, being like 9, 10 years old, trying to stay up as long as you can and watch these. And you could wake up at like 4 a.m. and stuff like that and just see it. It was a whole week. It was an event. It was.
Yeah, and I was misremembering it when we were talking about it because I thought that they started on Friday nights and ran all weekend long. No, there was Sunday nights at 6:30 is when they started, and it would run until about 6 p.m. Monday, Labor Day. So it was like 21 and a half hours or something like that. Or my math's a little off, but it's like in the 21 and a half hour range. And it was, what did you call it? The Super Bowl of comedy?
Because the Super Bowl wasn't the Super Bowl for me. First of all, football wasn't my jam as a kid, and the Patriots were absolutely horrible. And this is before the Boston Breakers, so this is before the US. So we literally made a big deal about getting together and like what snacks we're going to have, how much soda could we drink to stay up as long as you possibly can to take it all in. So between the telethons and the other thing is all of his movies, were always on Channel 56 or Channel 38, the two big UHF channels in New England at the time. It was always the late night.
In my day, UHF was a frequency on television where we would get movies from back in my day.
So I did. I liked all of those campy, I was a slapstick class clown. So I would try to do as much as the pratfalls. I've been doing the ladies, honestly,
nice lady,
and the thing with the other, and then you take
the wow.
I've been doing that shit since I was 5, 6, 7, and it all came from watching Jerry Lewis.
Yeah,
and you go back and. It's like, you remember stuff, you misremember stuff, but doing all the research and getting back, it's like, oh, fuck, I forgot he did that.
So do you want to just run through the highlights of his career, like his early years?
Go right down the list.
So for another full disclosure, Jacques did all the research on this, so I'm just reading off of his paper. But, as he said, he worked with his parents at the age of 5 in the Catskills Act. By 15, he had his own act. And then he had dropped out of high school in 10th grade, apparently.
Never get anywhere.
Yeah, what a loser.
Whatever happened to him?
He didn't go to fight the Nazis. Had he lived a couple more years, maybe he'd have a second chance at fighting the Nazis.
Yeah, he was only here today.
Yeah, right. But he had apparently a heart murmur, so he was not fit to serve. Was he 4F or something, probably. Instead, he decided to team up with a little-known singer named... Oh, no, this is after World War II, after the war had ended. July 25th, 1946, a day which will live in comedy infamy.
And how he's 19 when he meets Dean Martin.
Yeah, wow.
He's 19, and Dean Martin's I think he's 8, 9 years older than him. Dean Martin is an established singer, and there used to be he wasn't gigantic. This was pre-Rat Pack, obviously, but he was a very well-known club lounge, performer. And he teams up with Lewis, and who's 19 years old. Think about it. He's like, we're failures in our mid-40s, or my mid-40s, but
I'm entering my 40s.
But at 19, he was one of the biggest nightclub acts, and they started as a nightclub act. Jerry just being a goofball in between Dean Martin singing,
and they were hot right out of the gate. Right?
Day one.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where, it was all word of mouth. It was all like, if you got a good review in like the New Yorker and stuff like that. And their act within several months wound them up. They started doing radio appearances. They were a guest on the first episode of the Ed Sullivan Show. But they were gigantic, almost like back then going and seeing a live club act was huge. It was... And again, it was risky to come off the road, come out of the clubs to do radio. But at the same time, there was, and again, the work ethic of that generation, especially with performers who would do a radio show, a TV show, and then turn around and go do a 10, 11 o'clock club show that same night.
Yeah. I saw an interview with Jerry Lewis on Letterman, where he would say like they did like 10 shows a night. They would do 10 shows a night, 10 like hour-long shows at these clubs because the money they were raking in, like they could pull in like thousands of dollars a night, You know, back in the 50s.
Yeah, right.
50s
The early,
they just could 40s. Not. The crowds were lined up around the block. You know, they'd bust people. You know, they'd have people come in, do a show, clear the crowd, replenish the crowd with a whole new group and a whole new set of money. And they would just they could not turn the money away.
And it's funny because so many people associate Jerry Lewis with Dean Martin. They lasted 10 years to the date because they had contracts with the studios. They ended up getting picked up, I think it was by Paramount Pictures. And the last 2 or 3 years, it became one of those things where, and so many things, it's like Dean Martin had the bigger name when they started, and Jerry didn't steal the show. He wasn't a show stealer or scene stealer. That was his act.
Yep.
He was the pratfall guy. He was, Dean Martin was always a straight guy, and if you know comedy, it's like it's hard to be the straight guy. It's sometimes it's easier to be the class clown, the guy who falls. And then you got the other guy staying in character. Dean Martin was obviously, a world-renowned singer at the time. But the press got, Jerry started getting more and more attention. And I guess, the story that I've read from a few places, I think Look magazine was on par with like Life magazine, and they were the cover story. Jerry had nothing to do with this. They cropped Dean Martin out of it.
No.
And they still had like months left on their contract. But the two of them, in a 10-year span of time, did thousands upon thousands of club shows. They had a radio show. They had a TV show, and they did 17 movies for Paramount, all that made money, all that were wildly successful. And so you associate them, as having been leaked for absolutely ever, when it was only a 10-year collaboration. But again, same thing. It's like Lennon and McCartney were together about 10 years, and here it is 50 years later. They're still considered. No one thinks of like Wings when they think Paul McCartney. It's not the first thing that comes to mind.
Right, and it's fascinating because they were an act 10 years to the date.
To the date, right. And then they didn't speak for nearly 20 years. There was a couple times it was interesting where, Jerry Lewis was doing a club show and always working. He was doing a movie called The Busboy that the studio was basically backing out of. Jerry was financing it himself. It was a shoestring budget. It was a tight shooting schedule, and they do it at the famous Fontainebleau. I don't think I'm pronouncing it right, but I've been there in Miami. And if you ever go to the Fontainebleau, you walk into the place and you feel like you walked into a time warp. It's, Hollywood, Florida, in Miami, Florida, used to be what Vegas and Hollywood is from after Vegas became Vegas and stuff. But for Miami, that was the place to be, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, especially for the club shows and stuff. So Jerry was doing the movie and doing club acts at night.
Wow.
He was basically suffering from exhaustion, and he didn't call Dean, but like one of, the people said, "Hey, you're in town. Can you come in and do this show for, fill in for Jerry?" He's like, "Yeah, sure." So they didn't, it was one of those things. And then you've seen the clips about when they finally reunited.
Yeah. So on Jerry's telethon, the MDA Labor Day Telethon in 1976, 20 years later, a little known mutual friend got them back together.
Who is this friend?
Frank Sinatra.
Never heard of him.
Okay. Frank Sinatra, he appears on Jerry's telethon. He's rapping with Jerry in front of the orchestra. They're just sort of chit-chatting, and then Frank says to Jerry, I want to bring out a friend of mine who he really wants to, he wants to say hello, and he wants to make a contribution to the telethon. And he comes on out, and it's Dean Martin. And the look on Jerry's face when he sees Dean is just like this sort of like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. Smiling ear to ear. Dean comes out, cigarette in hand.
Really? He was a smoker.
Yeah, he was. They give each other a hug, a little kiss on the cheek. They go into their act for,
right into, if you look it up.
Yeah, they go right into their act like they hadn't missed a beat.
I don't know.
So how you been?
It seems like we haven't seen each other for 20 years.
Well, there was all those rumors about our breaking up, and then when I started the show and you weren't here, I believed it. So you working?
No, I had to come in because I had to, I had to go, and this was the closest place.
You always have to go.
I always drink.
I don't know if Jerry dismisses himself or Frank kicks Jerry off stage to do a number with Dean, and then they would cut to Jerry on the side while Dean and Frank were singing, and you can just sort of see like this sort of like look of like, what did I miss out on in the last 20 years? Like, what was this all about?
And if you look at what, I mean, in that 20 years was the birth of the Rat Pack, and what Dean did and what he did solo, what he did with Frank. They really built Vegas. I mean, and stuff like that. And Jerry went on to do, I mean, seriously, in that 20 years, he did another 30-some movies. Both giants, but you can tell it's like, oh, fuck. The what is it? The sum of the whole is greater than the
sum of the parts is equal to the square root of the hypotenuse.
Anyways, they both.
We're not good with even theoretical math.
And I'm married to an Asian. Wait, that's
cut.
No, that's. Anyways, my kids are a quarter Asian, so they'll be good at math in the 6th grade. I'm thinking.
We'll save our racist Asian jokes for when we talk about with 6 you get egg roll.
But seriously, they realized, and they both had done interviews after that. It's like, what the fuck? Like, truly. But when you saw, when you see the clip, it's astonishing. It's like riding a bike. They just picked up where they left off. And the telethon actually started 10 years before. And Jerry was a regular, Jerry and Dean were regulars on the telethon that every year was hosted by different people. And the one year hosted by Bing Crosby and Bob Hope.
Right.
Who were Jerry and Dean just 10 years older and more down the road. And to see the four of them out there doing it. But it was the same act, and it was great when you see Jerry and Dean just fall into it. And it is. It's the look on both of them. It's like, they loved each other. This was truly, they had a fantastic marriage. It got rocky towards the end because stupid jealousy type thing.
Yep.
And then they didn't talk for 20 years. And it's like the friendship that they missed out on in that time. You could tell both of them were like, we're just assholes.
Yeah, and then they maintained a friendship off screen pretty much for the rest of Dean's life, which was about 20 years.
And here's a fun fact that I did not know that.
I did not know that.
Norman Lear was one of their early comedy writers.
Wow.
Like we're going back 1940, so they get together 46. It's 1948, 48, 49 that Norman Lear comes into the picture as one of the writers. And again, it's like you harken back to your show or shows and you see who Sid Caesar's writers were, and it was just
like Woody Allen and all those guys. Yeah.
And he was the youngest one. I mean, everybody. But when you think Norman Lear, this is 30 years before Norman Lear, or about 25 years before Norman Lear, is Norman Lear, who completely dominated the television landscape all through the 70s and the early 80s.
Yep.
Completely dominated. But he started off as a bit writer for these guys.
Right. And then another fun fact about Martin and Lewis is apparently they had their own comic book.
From DC Comics, of all things.
Right.
Those of you who don't know DC Comics, go fuck yourself.
Yeah.
But the greatest comic magazine ever, Batman, Superman, all that. But yeah, they had a long-running comic as Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, and then when they broke up, they stuck with Jerry Lewis. It was another, decade-plus run. Just Jerry, and they did. They like everything else. They had Batman do episodes. They had Superman. They had their A-listers, and it was a very almost what do you call it? Like an Archie's kind of comic slapsticky thing.
I'm just envisioning if Martin and Lewis had stuck together through the 60s, would they have appeared on Scooby-Doo together?
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. Yeah, they would have done all of that. They would have done all the TV. They would have shown up on an episode of the Brady's. That would have happened, all that kind of stuff. Like the Brady's go to Vegas. What?
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, no, that was it was fun going back. But again, when you talk about him starting at 5 with his family on stage, that was just the way it was. There was no child labor laws, or I've never heard the stories of him resenting that. And when he had his own act at age 15, and Joe and I were just watching a clip of it. Well, not when he was 15. There's no footage of that. But his routine was pantomiming to records. Like he would just come out with a record player, put the needle down, and pantomime playing and singing, the whole thing, but over the top, exaggerated comedic form. That, we see, there's a documentary out there that we were watching footage of where it's showing a clip of one of his late 50 movies, and he's doing that same bit.
Yeah, it was Method to the Madness of Jerry Lewis. It was the documentary trailer that we watched.
And in that trailer, you see that, and then you're like, oh, wait a minute. Like, when you see the famous Birth of Andy Kaufman on Saturday Night Live doing his coming out with a record player as Latka, and that was the one line that you were talking about that he knew
Here I come to save the day. Yeah, he'd sing along to the Mighty Mouse theme song, and they only know the one line, "Here I come to save the day." But it was sort of a take on apparently the Jerry Lewis just sort of pantomiming to a record, which was done 20 years prior.
Yeah. Well, his Catskill thing was done maybe.
Oh yeah, so 30
years prior,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
This guy was comedy, and then speaking of comedy, it's like he probably, if you're my age, like the biggest movie that he did like post 80s was King of Comedy.
Yeah, King of Comedy.
Couple of nobodies in that.
Robert De Niro, Sandra Bernhard. Yeah, and
who directed that?
Martin Scorsese.
Never heard of him.
Whatever. Anyways, a little movie that was filmed in New York City about a guy, Rupert Pupkin, who wanted to be a big time like celebrity talk show host. So Rupert Pupkin is a fan of talk show host Jerry Langford. And it was originally, apparently, the character's name was going to be Larry Langford. And when they were producing the movie, Jerry was talking with Marty Scorsese, I call him Marty, about changing the character's name from Larry to Jerry, because if they're filming in and around New York City, he said, it would probably be better if we named the character Jerry, because you're going to get a reaction that you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise with any other star. And so they film the scene, and immediately he gets out of his cab, he's walking down the street, Jerry Lewis, and all of a sudden you see construction workers from rooftops yelling, "Hey, Jerry!" And cab drivers, "Jerry, what's going on?" So he's essentially given them hundreds of free extras in this movie that they didn't realize that were being filmed because he was that known to people.
And that's one of the brilliant things with Jerry Lewis is nothing was accidental. His comedy, although it looked like slapstick and largely improvised, but the improv was well rehearsed ish. He knew what he was doing. There was always something going on. He knew all the pieces on the board. And again, I reached out to my friend Orly, who is she works in film in France. She didn't migrate there. She's born and raised in France, and she's been in the film industry over there for a decade plus. And I reached out to her and I asked her, it's like, why did the French love him so much? And she's like, I really don't know, but they really did. And I looked into it more and more, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that he was an artist. He was a writer. He was a director. He did not invent, but he truly pioneered playback in video. He was one of the first real directors, and it was kind of a crude bastardization of security footage. Like when security was, cameras first became a thing, it was always recorded to tape.
Closed circuit television kind of thing.
And that's what he used. He ended up instead of waiting.
He had instant replay basically.
So he really pioneered that. But at the same time, he loved filmmaking. He loved the process of filmmaking. And, Joe and I have done skits on different iterations of comedy shows we've done, making fun of arrogant French filmmakers. But he was one of those guys. He was a complete slapstick clown, but also revered as an artist and in a culture and in a society over there that really put an emphasis. I mean, and it's a funny thing. Even now, it's starting to change in the rest of the world, where you used to just go see a movie because this actor was in it. And they started to, they were 20 years ahead of the curve where people would go see a movie because this guy directed it. So they knew the directors, where before it didn't matter who directed, as long as Jerry and Dean were in it, anybody was going to go see it. But that was one of the reasons that they loved him so much.
Yeah, here's a quick rundown of some of the films that Jerry did on his own, starting with The Bellboy from 1960. He went on to do Cinderfella, The Ladies' Man, The Errand Boy, It's Only Money, The Nutty Professor, Who's Minding the Store, The Patsy, The Disorderly Orderly, The Family Jewels. Yeah,
and the Family Jewels, it's one of my favorite. It's one of those things where he plays 7 different roles.
Right.
It's an orphan who has to pick between her 6 different uncles who all want nothing to do with her, but just wants the money she's inherited, and he plays all 6 uncles and the chauffeur driver who drives her to see all the uncles.
Did you know? Did you know this? I did not know this, Jacques. He was in an episode of Batman.
I did.
Damn it.
Yeah.
He was a citizen.
Well, that's when we did our Adam West thing, when we were talking about where Batman wanted to, all these A-listers wanted to be on it. He was one of those, the man on the street, just.
Yeah, the guy that pops his head out the window while they're climbing.
Yeah, they had Sammy Davis Jr. be one of those guys, and this was just the guy on the street type thing. Yeah,
there's Boeing, 3 on a Couch, Way Out, The Big Mouth. Then there's also a movie that he wrote and directed. That was a passion project. It was an infamous movie that was
really. Tell me about it.
It was never released, unfortunately. I don't know if it'll ever be released. Maybe now that he's passed, maybe there'll be some renewed interest in releasing this.
Right. Well, the word was that he's had all copies destroyed, but there were rumors. There's a rumor.
Yeah.
That there was a couple of copies floating around.
Right. I mean, there have been actors actually Harry Shearer. He's reported that he's actually seen the movie.
Really?
Yes.
And what is this movie? A family comedy, right? A little romp through.
The Day the Clown Cried.
And you wanna bring down the room by telling the premise?
The easy one sentence synopsis is Jerry plays a clown in a Nazi concentration camp who has to cheer up the children before they get marched into the ovens.
Right. He's entertaining the children on their way into the gas chambers.
Gas chambers, right, not the ovens. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. I mean, I guess they get burned after they get gas, but, we're splitting hairs here.
But seriously, that, really? Oh, and when you think about that, this is... Again, that movie's made less than 30 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, and it's wow. It's just hard to imagine that anybody thought this was going to be a good idea.
And I was wrong. He did not write it. It was based on a script of the same name by Joan O'Brien, this I'm reading off Wikipedia, who had co-written the original script with Charles Denton 10 years previously. And this was from 1972 when they filmed this. He was ashamed of the work at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Which is why it's not released.
The other thing with the French, he spoke French like a native, and so when he shot movies in France, there was no bad overdubs, there was no bad translation. But yeah, when and I think this was shot in France. I think that's where the production of this had happened.
You could be right. Yeah, I'm not reading anything.
Which I think is one of the.
Oh no, it began in Sweden, and maybe it got moved to France. But and it's just one of these fascinating kind of talk about urban legends. This is probably one of the top 3 urban legends in filmmaking.
Film history.
Yeah. I don't know if the Swedes produced this or if the French produced this or the Germans. The Germans.
I guess not the Germans.
Right. But they reenact scenes from the script and then interlace it with found footage of the movie. Oh. So you can go online and look this up. There are excerpts of the movie that you can see online of The Day the Clown Cried with original real footage, but then they fill in the blanks with kind of black box, reenacting of these scenes. But it's fascinating that this was actually something that he put his money into and wanted. He thought it was a good idea at the time.
Right. So, I mean, again, this is a guy who was at 19 years old just killing it, doing dozens of shows a week with Dean. He passed away with dates on the book. There isn't a comedian who's, let's say, over 30, 35 who doesn't say, I can date back this bit or this part of my comedy to him, whether it's a stage performer or whether it's a slapstick. I mean, and yeah, he didn't win everybody over. You know, we're not saying he didn't make, you know, ruffle some feathers on the way. He had some, you know, parts of him that, you know, certain, you know, hard to work with and arrogant and stuff, but a true pioneer in filmmaking.
Before we wrap up, we should probably spend a little bit of time. You kind of teased it. We talked about it throughout the podcast, but the really big thing that most people from our generation know Jerry from is from the MDA Telethon. That's where you got to see a taste of old Hollywood, and sort of that old Vegas,
right?
You know?
It had, well, the funny thing is, it started when he started doing it was done in L.A.
Yep.
And 2 or 3 years, I think 2 or 3 years in, Ed McMahon went from being kind of the announcer to being a complete co-host. And oh, who's that other guy that Ed McMahon worked for? Oh yeah, Johnny Carson used to start the show with doing the monologue before it moved to Vegas. But you had that old Vegas-y feel, but it had a lot of like the current actors and stuff like that. I mean, so he was bridging the gap through that whole time with the older people and bringing in, you know, the actors that the kids would know.
Yeah. I mean, he started the telethon in 1966, called its network of participating stations the Love Network, originated in Los Angeles for 28 of the years that it had been broadcast. We saw it locally here on Channel 5. It was certainly an event. It was a chance for us to see acts like Rickles. As the years went on, the acts became less and less known and less desirable, I guess, or they weren't as big a grabbers as, say, a Don Rickles. When we get to the 2000s, that's when, you know, with the advent of the internet, people had more choices, more ways to donate to the MDA. And then, you know, the acts just became older and tired. And then they started becoming a parody of themselves. And then, you know, you can look on YouTube in like 2003, Jerry became ill. And he was undergoing some treatment for some ailment. And he became very large and very puffy. He might have been taking some steroids. But there's a memorable... I think it's memorable because I just recently watched it. Don Rickles comes out on a 2003 appearance and sits down on a couch next to Jerry, who's at his desk, and just lambasts him. I mean, lambasts him for his size, lambasts people in the audience, material that you would not ever get away with today, and he barely got away with it back in 2003. It was just an awful thing. But the 2000s is when those acts, like you would see like these acts diminish in quality over the years. You know, you would have like the one Don Rickles come out, and then everybody else would be like, you know, the spoon player from down the street. You know? I think like the Chocolate Rain guy from the internet made an appearance. Never mind.
I hope not.
But Ed McMahon stuck throughout the whole thing, and it was kind of... And then, yeah, by the time the 2010s rolled around, the show went from a 21-hour event to like a 3-hour event.
Yeah.
Because of his age, he couldn't do the telethon as long as he could in the previous years.
You know, and it's funny how perceptions changed over the years, where there was a lot of people who didn't like the idea that people went from him raising money in like a pity party and all the money was being spent on like curing this thing versus being spent on helping people live.
He did raise $2 billion over the course of his lifetime for the Muscular Dystrophy Association. So nothing to sneeze at. But still,
and again, he did it from a good place, and he started doing, you know, when he started doing the telethon, it had already been running, that he had already been making appearances on and stuff like that. So,
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, and part of the criticism came from a woman who Jerry had never met, and this maybe lead to the next topic of controversy for Jerry Lewis. But Jerry Lewis did a town hall for Sirius XM Radio a couple of years ago, and Maria Menounos was the host, and she was asking Jerry if there was anybody that he missed, because, all of his friends had been dying off in recent years. And he says, is there anybody that you would miss the most? And he goes, well, you don't miss somebody the most. You miss all of them dearly, except for Joan Rivers. And then, so she's like, what does that mean? He goes, well, when I was doing the telethon, Joan had come out and said in the press that if it weren't for the telethon, Jerry wouldn't have a career. And I thought that was just mean and disrespectful, and it undermined everything that I was trying to do for this organization. And I had never met the woman, and I'm glad I kept that streak alive. Essentially,
ouch.
Yeah, and by the time the interview happened, Joan had passed. But yeah, he got criticism, and then it also led to maybe some comments that he had made in later years about female comedians in general.
Right. Well, but on the other hand, then you have people like Carol Burnett saying like she had a career because she was basically doing Jerry Lewis. She had adopted so much of his physical comedy and stuff like that. You don't excuse bad behavior just because it's a generational thing. But hey, I'm not saying all his ideals would have been great.
And what I'm talking about specifically was that he had mentioned to reporters in his later years that he was asked, which female comedians do you find most entertaining nowadays? And he said something to the effect of none of them. The long and the short of it is that he didn't like the way that some female comedians try to do a quote unquote a male act, where they try to be over the top and kind of outrageous and maybe a little gross. He felt probably in his kind of old sexist mind that women should hold themselves to a higher standard and be more elegant versus getting down in the dirt.
So he wouldn't be yelling, "Get off my lawn," if they weren't on his lawn in the first place. So why? No, but here's the other thing. It's like, so he starts really being a public figure at age 19. So you're talking over 65 years. He's going to say awful Archie Bunker-esque things coming from that age. He's not, when he's done, and gosh, let's see, he did like 17 movies with Dean Martin in 10 years, and then he did another 40-some after that.
Well, let's put it in perspective. Another person who's been around as long as Jerry Lewis, maybe not so much in the limelight, but who's up there in age with Jerry Lewis, Norman Lear.
Yeah. Okay.
Speaking of Archie Bunker-esque things, what's the most Archie Bunker-esque thing that Norman Lear has ever said publicly that it wasn't through the lips of Archie Bunker?
Which was what?
No, I'm asking you.
Oh, right, yeah, no.
So you can be old and not be an asshole.
Really?
Yeah.
Because as I'm getting older, I'm finding that's not so much the case.
Like, okay, so like Carl Reiner's still around. Mel Brooks. Like these aren't these aren't people with chauvinistic ideals who grew up in the same exact culture as
what did I tell you about bringing facts into my arguments? You don't come over here spouting,
don't bring a knife to a gunfight, motherfucker.
So but again, so perfect person, no, but truly, and again, maybe Mel Brooks would be the last link to that era, but he again is 10 years past, or 10 years younger, I think. He's in his
90s. These are these are all 90-something-year-old people.
Yeah, because Norman Lear, has 2 or 3 books coming out.
He has a podcast, a weekly podcast.
That's awesome.
All the things above, by the way. But yeah, no, you can be old and nice at the same time, apparently. I guess you just have to have the right perspective. And Jerry shouldn't be remembered for hating women in comedy or for taking money from crippled kids.
I don't think he took the money.
Oh, okay. Whoops. Okay. I don't know what I'm doing now.
But no, let's end on a high note. I would.
Bill Cosby.
So at least he's not raping the women he didn't think were funny.
Well, I also want to bring in one other thing, is that the influence in pop culture that Jerry Lewis has had. I mean, everybody does The Voice. Everybody knows The Voice. And of course, the most known kind of obscure character in pop culture today is on The Simpsons.
Right.
Professor Frank.
Yes, and the beakers and
With the glavin and the hay and the hay. Well, that would require some sort of a rebigulator, which the very thought of would make me laugh. With the hay and the hoe and the hay and the whoa. Done by Frank Azaria, by the way.
I almost forgot. It's like, so doing the research, and I had seen it years ago. I am not a religious man, but I do pray at the altar of Kurt Vonnegut. I think the greatest American novelist of all time. I think he should have been made king of the world somewhere in the late 60s, early 70s. It'd be a complete utopia. Anyways, Kurt Vonnegut books cannot be turned into good movies. It has never happened. It kills me to say that. It's never happened. There's been a couple short stories of his that has become shorts. You know, from his book, Welcome to the Monkey House, people have taken collections of like 3-page stories and made shorts of them. Like, it's called Welcome to the Monkey House. That's worth a watch. But Jerry Lewis and Madeline Kahn did a movie called Another Kind, Slapstick. And they play their own parents. They were freaks of nature. They were like 7 feet tall twins that were so ugly and hideous, born to like the richest people in America at the time. And this is when America is down in the dumps and like gas is too expensive, so they converted all the cars to run on chicken poop. Even Air Force One is running chicken poop. And the brother and sister are the smartest people who've ever walked the planet, but they have to be they basically have to be having sex, and they can solve all the world's problems, including gravity, including this. And I think the Rotten Tomato, so where Under the Red Hood had a score of, what was it?
100%.
What do you think the score of Slapstick was?
0%.
It was 0%. And I watched it in its entirety. And I'm like, oh, and it was one of those things where it's not that bad. Well, if you look at it from, if you take into consider.
Yeah, that's like trying to defend Trump. It's like basically trying to defend Donald Trump.
Right.
Well, he's not a Nazi. Well,
and if it's, I knew it had a 0, and I rewatched it knowing that you can't make a good Vonnegut movie. It was on YouTube. I didn't even feel like Redbox stole $1.98 from me. No late fees for not rewinding the tape and bringing it back. I'm not going to say it's worth a watch, but if you see a couple clips. But on a high note, I would look at that the documentary that you referenced earlier.
The Method of the Madness of Jerry Lewis.
I would recommend Family Jewels. No double entendre there. I would watch the movie Family Jewels. It was pretty great. But if you want to watch a couple of clips and try not to fall down the rabbit hole, just Google any of the Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis stuff. It's campy. It's a bit dated, but it's still hysterical.
Yeah, and Jerry Lewis on David Letterman, a couple of great appearances. Again,
him and Ned McMahon worked together for 40 years on the telethon. And there's one great clip that I recently saw where Johnny Carson also spoke complete fluent French. Again, they did almost a whole interview in French. And I can't imagine how many people in America were thrilled with that night. But it was great. But yeah, he did a couple great Letterman interviews. But it's hard not to go down the rabbit hole. I like old comics. I like the stuff from the late 40s, the early 50s. Like I said to Joe, it's like I was born definitely 50 years too late. I love that Catskill shit. But yeah, I mean, doing the research and stuff like that, I did. I started watching like a 2-3 minute clip, and like 4 hours later, I'm like, oh crap, I haven't fed the kids. I'm still sitting here in my boxers. Attractive.
Yeah,
ladies. All right. On that note, we're wrapping it up. Rest in peace, Jerry. And do not forget,